Yeah, welcome. I'm David Bogle, Chair of the Homes for Cathy Group and also Chief Executive of Hightown Housing Association here in Hertfordshire. Thank you for coming. It's to this session. We're relaunching our commitments after some time. For those who don't know and haven't been with us for the whole journey, we sort of started in 2016, 17. Homes for Cathy to commemorate really the 50th anniversary of Cathy Come Home being shown on BBC television. And a lot of housing associations were formed from that movement. There was a great outcry about homelessness, and lots of volunteers and churches and other groups formed housing associations. And associations like Hightown and Broadland and many others featured in Homes for Cathy were formed around that time. Since what we did fairly early on was try to link up with local authorities and national groups, and formed a particular close connection with Crisis. And through them, we put together our 9 Homes for Cathy commitments, which were commitments that we thought that housing associations should be signing up to as part of their, well, as a central part of their core purpose, their social values as an organisation. We were founded to end homelessness, and 50 years later, of course, there's still a homelessness. 55 years later now, there's still a homelessness crisis. So our work is as needed as ever. And Homes for Cathy firmly believes that housing associations should be doing all they can to build new homes, support people out of homelessness, and sustain them in their tenancies. So the commitments were all about that. We wrote them in partnership with our members at that point and with Crisis, and Crisis put them in their plan to end homelessness back in 2018, which is still a great document. Fast forward to 2023, I think, and we were coming out of COVID and lockdown, and we decided we'd have a strategic review of Homes for Cathy. Got a lot of people along to our office in Hemel Hempstead and went through where we should be going for the future. And one of the thoughts coming out of that was that we needed to have another look at the commitments. We've been working with them for 6 years, 5 years, and some of them were becoming a bit clunky. So we got feedback from our members, and I've spent the last year or so consulting. It was a subject at the Homes for Cathy conference last year. And we've come up with some new commitments. They don't change radically. The great thing is they're more efficient because we've got 7 commitments now rather than 9. But broadly, we've got the old ones there, but they've been reworded to take account of a number of quite a lot of feedback that we had. I think particularly feedback on commitment number 3, which was about, if I can find it, was about offering constructive solutions to applicants who aren't deemed eligible for an offer for a home. And that was, I think a lot of members were struggling with that one, because really it was the responsibility of the local authority, primary housing authority, to deal with that side of things. So we've kind of amalgamated a number of commitments, including that one, into a sort of general duty to be flexible and helpful on allocations, and put the onus on housing associations to be working with local authorities to help people to access housing association properties to end homelessness. We've also suggested that housing associations should be managing their refusals and benchmarking performance against other housing associations. We've said that the old commitment number 4, which was about not seeking to make any tenant homelessness who was interacting with the association, should go hand in hand with tenancy support. So encouraging housing associations to offer tenancy sustainment services. And we've also had a major revision of the commitment to supporting and helping with people who are vulnerable in the community. So a new number 4 is all about working with applicants with a background of homelessness, including people from ethnic minorities, LGBTQ plus community, migrants, helping them to access, so minority groups to access housing who are homeless. So they're the main things, I think. Michael, we're going to sort of show you the new commitments now, I think, with any luck, and hope that you'll be happy with them. As I say, they've gone through a lot of consultation, and I guess, you know, people will be able to quibble with a word here or a word there, but hopefully they put across what we as housing associations are trying to do in that space, important space of ending homelessness and using our properties and our support services and everything else to help move people out of homelessness into decent, well-maintained accommodation, and to provide that support where it's needed to help them to maintain their tenancy and not set them up to fail. And of course, the final one at the end there, the seventh one, is still unchanged broadly. You know, we're hoping Housing Association will take part in campaigning and challenging and inspiring people to work to end homelessness, including, of course, in this very important year where there's like to be a general election. And we're very much keen on trying to get the political parties to put something on homelessness, positive on homelessness in their manifestos, and working with others to try and achieve that. So with that kind of introduction, I'm going to hand over to Michael and ask him to talk about embedding the commitments in your organisation. So Michael Newey, who's Chief Executive of Broadland Housing Association and a board member of Homes for Cathy, and someone who's been a huge support for Homes for Cathy for many years. Michael.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Before I move into my presentation, we quickly put this slide, which hopefully everybody can see, with the 7 new commitments into the front of the presentation this morning, and it's right at my last slide as well, for anybody that wants to either do shorthand or take a screen print. The reason I'm leaving it up there is sort of bridging with what David just said about lobbying. It was interesting. We had a Homes for Cathy Norfolk Strategic Housing Partnership conference in Norwich on Tuesday, which I'll come back to. And I think one of the most difficult questions when we had a panel discussion with myself, my chair, and one of our senior managers was, how do you lobby effectively as an individual organisation to tackle homelessness? And we very much felt in our comments that it is working with others, that when you're a single voice, yes, you might have a good relationship with the local MP or local councillors, but actually joining on campaigns run by others, National Housing Federation, the Chartered Institute of Housing, the RICS, all these other bodies, and adding sort of depth of our experience of trying to provide services is really helpful, but sort of a sense of realism about how much we can do as individuals on a national scale. So my presentation, on Tuesday when I gave a similar presentation, apologies to anyone who was here on Tuesday in Norwich, we were trying to come up with 3-letter acronyms on Tuesday. That seemed to be the theme of the day. And my 3-letter acronym for this morning's presentation is MAP, which sort of stands for motivation, accountability and partnerships. The brief I got from David and Vicky was to talk about how we have embedded commitments in Broadland over the last 6 years, how we get board and executive buy-in. I'm a huge believer, and I'll keep coming back to this, that unless you have executive and senior leadership commitment, it's really hard to deliver in the long term. Sort of our front lines can deliver so much, but unless they hear that it's a real priority for the business, then it's a real challenge. How we've engaged with staff and wider stakeholders on homelessness, and actually annual reporting, which I actually would probably say monthly reporting on performance, because that's how you really embed things. So before I actually get into the content of what I want to talk about, I think it's worth first saying that actually tackling homelessness is a team exercise. No one individual and no one organisation has all the solutions. So yes, it's really important that within an organisation, everybody's signed up to the commitments, everyone's signed up to the general intention, the purpose of the organisation. But actually, unless we work with other organisations, we're not going to deliver what we could deliver, and no single organisation, whether it's local authority, health, police, housing associations, homelessness charities, the lot, has all the answers. And actually that was a really strong message that came through on Tuesday at our conference, where we had 2 senior police officers talking about how they tackle homelessness, and also willing to engage with the audience about when they're actually part of the problem and sometimes not the solution. So my sort of retrospective look back over the last decade is probably where we failed individuals. It's because we've missed opportunities to work in the team with others, and we've become a little bit parochial about our own boundaries. So David mentioned it in his introductory comments that Broadland's been around a long time. Broadland is 61 years old this year. And actually, I think we were formed in 63. I think our first board meeting happened around the 7th or 9th of January of 1963. And the purpose that we started with is still the purpose we have today. I think there's a real strength in organisations knowing their enduring purpose, knowing that if somebody walked in from the original board that set us up, they would recognise Broadland as the organisation they thought they were trying to establish. And we were very much coming out of housing need in the early 60s, a response to local authorities not having enough housing stock to tackle all the problems, and actually tackling homelessness initially in Norwich and then across Norfolk. When I was reflecting last year with our staff team about our 60th birthday, we came up with the fact that we've worked through, shall we put it that way, 15 different prime ministers, 41 housing ministers. Of course, that's a bit distorted by having 6 since July 2022. But I think that the important point there is that we've made it a priority to hold to our enduring purpose, despite or with whichever political party happens to be in government at the time. I was tackled about 5 or 6 years ago. I'm trying to think who was Prime Minister. I think it was when Theresa May was Prime Minister. I was tackled by a cabinet minister who wanted to know whether we were doing what the Prime Minister had ordered us to do. That was his phrase, which was all about home ownership. And I sort of was explaining the purpose of Broadland. He said, "You're not answering my question. Are you doing what the Prime Minister has instructed you to do?" And I said, "Well, actually, we've got an independent board of trustees, and they're the ones that decide what we do as a charitable organisation." It was then very awkward because we spent another 3 hours sitting opposite each other at a dinner table without saying a word. But I do think there's something about holding true to as organisations to our purpose, knowing what our purpose is, and being willing to work with politicians locally and nationally and others when they coincide with our purpose, but not getting so distracted that actually we lose sight on the reason we were set up for in the first place. I think for Broadland, it's been fundamentally important to have a golden thread through the organisation from top to bottom, where everybody knows what we're trying to achieve on homelessness. I was saying on Tuesday that I thought that anyone who'd been at Broadland for more than 3 or 4 months probably knows all about Homes for Cathy, whatever their role in the organisation. And I think the sort of bedrock of that is having that very visible commitment by board and executive and directors and senior managers that this is really important. I haven't sat down, and I think I won't, and worked out how many board members, directors, senior managers we've had over the last 61 years, but it's a lot. And it's been the baton of homelessness and tackling housing need has been passed from one to another. And we've never had a situation where a chair has turned around and said, "I actually don't think tackling homelessness or tackling housing need is a priority for the business." And I think that's been really, really useful. We're in the midst of just starting recruiting for some new board members. And we had a meeting yesterday afternoon and we said it was fundamental that they understood our purpose. And if they're not going to be comfortable signing up to an organisation that is tackling housing need and homelessness, then actually they're probably not applying for the right role in the right organisation. And I very much see housing associations as part of the homelessness sector. I think sometimes we separate ourselves away. And actually, it was interesting I've been to homelessness conferences where there's only been 3 housing associations in the room. And I've been housing conferences where there's been no homelessness organisations in the room. And actually, if we as social landlords providing, let's put it bluntly, the most affordable homes, rented homes around, don't see ourselves as part of the homelessness sector and part of the solution to homelessness, there's something fundamentally wrong. Now, I know we're relaunching the new commitments this morning, or the refreshed commitments, the slimmed down. They've obviously been on a diet, but I think going back to the context of which David mentioned, of working with Crisis in 2017, coming up with the housing association commitments at the back of their plan to end homelessness, and progressing it. We took it to our board in September of 2018, and I was really encouraged that we had complete unanimous support that Broadland should sign up for all 9 commitments, not just any easy ones that we might have been able to pick off. So just a few examples, because you all hopefully know about the 9 commitments, but things that we did: resisting evictions for arrears. I'll come back to this in a minute, but we do not evict for arrears unless the tenant is not willing to engage with us. So the board gave us permission, to the horror, let's be honest, of our income collection team at the time, to freeze arrears, to take away the tool of saying, well, we're going to go for an eviction to try to encourage you to pay your rent. Actually, if you're not paying your rent and you've got a problem, let's freeze the arrears for a year. Please pay your rent in the meantime. We'll work with you on that. And then we'll come back in a year's time and start looking at how you can actually come back with the repayment plan. And what was really interesting, having taken away the tool of easy evictions, we actually found our arrears went down, but also the cost to us. So we were estimating, we were evicting normally when somebody had £3,500 to £4,000 worth of arrears. When you added on void costs and legal costs and staff time, we reckoned each eviction was costing us £9,000 to £10,000. So actually, we were quids in, because we weren't writing off the arrear, we weren't incurring the additional cost, and we were keeping a family, a household in their home. We provided homes to the Norfolk County Council's People from Abroad team for people with no recourse to public funding at a peppercorn rent. So the board were willing to actually forego rental income, because they actually knew there was a social purpose, a social need for people who had no recourse, who had lost their jobs, to give them that breathing space between deciding whether they're going to go back to their original country or whether they can find new employment in the UK. And we do not turn down any nominations on the grounds of affordability. And it comes back to us seeing ourselves as a part of the homelessness sector. If we're saying that a prospective tenant cannot afford our rents, how can they possibly be better off going into the private rented sector when the rents are higher? So let's go in with our eyes open. Let's know that someone's going to have an affordability challenge. Let's make sure they've got tenancy support at day one. But let's not say, no, we're pulling up the drawbridge, so to speak. And I think what's been really important over the last 6 years is that ongoing mandate. We talk about it constantly. The board are asking about it. The board are not challenging. They've never challenged us, even in really difficult times. Last year, for many of us, certainly for Broadland, was probably our toughest financial year that we've had in our 61 years. And the board never said, you know what, perhaps this is the year we have to ditch responding to housing need. I'm a huge believer that what gets measured and reported gets focused on. And therefore, I mentioned a few minutes ago, we actually have monthly performance reports, which include a number of pages that I'll share with you briefly on homelessness targets. So it's constantly there. The board can access that at any time. It's a common theme to discussion in our performance meetings. So that's really important. And it's really important that we report monthly. It's really important we put in our annual review. And it's really important that we actually update all our stakeholders and our shareholders, our members, about what we're trying to do there. And then it's really important also to be held accountable locally. Perhaps more informal to our local stakeholders, often in dialogue, but we also have the Norfolk Strategic Housing Partnership, which came out of COVID actually in 2020, which has all the key partners: health, local authorities, probation, DWP, housing associations, homelessness organisations, and reporting through them and to them and with them about what we're doing. There is a gap in accountability, which I think I've left a slide in to come back to a bit later, which is the RSH. Despite all the reforms that we've seen in consumer regulation and in reporting performance, there are we as a housing sector do not report any KPIs to the regulator which actually focus on homelessness. And I think that's a real flaw. So I'm going to share 5 pages from our monthly Power BI report. So the first one is sustaining tenancies. So what percentage of tenancies that started a year ago are still tenants? So are we making sure that we aren't seeing people fail in the first year for whatever reason? I'm not going to go into these in depth. These are all end of year because they're the March 24 performance. And as you can see, we sort of tracking this one the previous 3 years so we can see where there's patterns. The absolute number of evictions and abandonments, which we added about a year ago. So the reason for the eviction, so you can see we actually had 5 evictions, sadly, for arrears in the last 12 months, and we had 6 for antisocial behaviour, and we had 4 abandonments. Sorry, that's not 4, that's 5 abandonments. So actually knowing that and then trying to dig into the reasons behind, was there anything that we could have done that would have prevented that tenancy failing for whatever reason, or us failing it? The next slide, we are going to revise the way we look at this because it's working in absolute numbers as opposed to percentage of lettings. But each month we report to the board how many of our new tenants come from a homelessness background. So how many of them, their circumstances meant that they would have been identified as at risk or experiencing homelessness. It's not very helpful just knowing there were 6 in the month because you don't know how many relets we did in the month. So we're actually going to add in the percentage of lettings, but it's roughly about a third of our tenancies we think are to people coming from a homelessness background. And then the next one is actually reporting on the work of the tenancy support team, because one of our responsibilities is to try to prevent homelessness, not just try to provide homes to people coming from a homeless background. So I think we still got to work to do to work out what are the best objective indicators, but this particular slide shows that we're currently reporting on what is the financial benefit to the tenant of the work that our tenancy support team does in either reducing their arrears, one-off benefit gains, or actually accessing benefits in a long-term way. And then the last one that I'll share is looking at young people. We're particularly conscious of the challenge for young people, particularly under 25. I think I've got a slide later which talks about universal credit and the fact that they are particularly penalised by that, and therefore the chance of failing their tenancy is much higher. So we report to the board the percentage of tenancies that started a year ago where the tenant is still a tenant when the tenant was under 25 at the time of sign up. So we're very much focusing on youth homelessness as well. Now, I mentioned earlier very briefly my disappointment. I think actually David's disappointment, most sector's disappointed, I hope, about the lack of accountability to the regulator of social housing. So the regulator has no visibility on our void turnarounds. We aim to do void turnarounds in about 18 days. That's our target. It was 16 days, it's gone out to 18 days. I know that many other landlords actually have very different targets. And there's something at the bottom of that slide I put about balancing the needs. We know that we could probably provide a slightly better reactive repair service if we deprioritized voids. But we make that choice that actually we will live with a slightly poorer response time on responsive maintenance so that we can actually reduce the number of nights, days that homes are left empty. And I think it's a real flaw that the regulator doesn't look at that. I equally think it's a flaw that they don't look at allocations or tenancy sustainment or evictions. We've lost an opportunity for benchmarking across the sector to know what's good and what's not so good, and therefore to get challenged ourselves about how we can improve whatever we're doing in our own organisation. I've already mentioned the Norfolk Strategic Housing Partnership, and we also have the Norfolk Homelessness Solutions Forum, both of which came out of COVID years. I think I mentioned earlier the fact we've got health there, physical and mental, social services, local authorities, police, justice, support aid. In many ways, if someone had told me in 2019 that sort of 18 months later, we would have a forum that had all the key partners in the room at the same time, I would say, yeah, it's a bit of a pipe dream, but maybe in 10 or 15 years. I think I would say on that as we've come away from COVID, it's been more difficult to hold senior and executive leaders in the room. which is a concern actually, and a real focus. It's why we held a conference this week, which we got the Bishop of Norwich to chair for us, specifically to try to get the senior leaders in the room. And we still didn't have enough senior leaders in the room. And I do believe that unless senior and executive leaders, non-executive as well, are showing their commitment and saying it's a business priority that we do something, it becomes increasingly more difficult for our frontline to achieve what we would like them to achieve. Supporting the partnership and the forum, and I haven't got a slide that goes into detail. We adopted the charter, and we are also adopting commitments, very much on the principle that, let's know what we're doing, how we're doing, what we're prioritising. On the informal partnership side, I would just give two examples very briefly. The first one is working with the Trussell Trust, and I come back on my next slide, something that Trussell Trusts are doing, which I do think we as a sector, we as individuals working in the sector need to really support, which is their Essentials campaign, that universal credit should cover the cost of heating, eating and renting. And we're also working with the Norwich Diocese of the Church of England on their work on the cost of living crisis. And we're working with two of the bishops, including the Bishop of Norwich and the Bishop of Lynn, in trying to target how we get everybody in the room talking about the same thing at the same time and making a difference. On the Essentials campaign from Trussell Trust, I do encourage everybody to just go and look on Google on Trussell Trust Essentials campaign. There was research that they did with Joseph Rantry, which just demonstrated that if you're receiving the maximum amount of universal credit, it will not cover all your costs. End of. And this graph on the left, the green line is what they think it should be, and the blocks are what universal credit actually is. So if somebody is in receipt of universal credit, they will not have enough money to cover their heating, housing, and food costs, and therefore they will have to make choices. One of the few things, no, that's a bit unfair. One of the things I've agreed with Michael Gove about is saying that actually damp and mold is not a lifestyle decision. I do think it's a fuel poverty consequence. And actually having a welfare system that isn't an adequate safety net is a really big issue. And therefore the Essentials campaign, I think, is something that all of us should be talking about at the Norfolk Strategic Housing Partnership on Tuesday, and at the Emerging Anti-Poverty Alliance in Norfolk on Monday. We were talking about trying to get all our can you hear all the noise in the background? Sorry, I've got builders in and they're demolishing the staircase.
Tiny bit.
Right, it's very disconcerting for me. So we were talking about actually asking all our candidates at the general election of all parties to sign up to the Essentials campaign and really focus on that, on the basis, going back to that lobbying point. Is there a simple ask that is really quite confrontational? And actually signing up to getting universal credit to adequately cover costs is, I think, a really big issue. My last slide before actually just putting back the 7 new commitments is just a sort of summary slide. And I deliberately put a quote in here from one of our residents who lives in one of our housing first properties, because I think sometimes we can get distracted in talking about numbers and statistics and big picture stuff. And somewhere along the line, we all need to remember it's actually about individual lives. And when we don't get it right, actually, it has really big consequences. But in summary, sort of motivation, be very, very open about the organisation's focus and commitment to ending homelessness, and actually using the word ending homelessness as opposed to just making a difference on homelessness. Accountability, I do believe that if you don't measure something and report something, it's much easier to forget about it. So we report on the commitments, we report on the monthly performance indicators. And on partnerships, just recognizing that we can't do it all on our own. And if we don't work effectively with others, then we will always deliver less than we could. And that was all I was going to say, David. And there's the commitments again. You're on mute, David.
As someone over, yeah, that's great. Thanks. Thank you, Michael. That was brilliant. A really great presentation, and I'm really inspired by what you're saying. I think we at Hightown try to match up to your level of commitment. I think we achieve it in some respects, but yeah, it's hard to deliver in every area all the time, isn't it? And but we can only try. So now we've got possibility of questions for Michael. There's a bit of time for a Q&A. So has anyone got anything they'd like to ask Michael? Can you see all of the Vicky? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there is quite a few. So I think it might be better if if anyone just wants to chip in, then just do so. Can't see anything on.
We'll Vicky, I'll get the commitment, the slides over to you so you can share them post this meeting.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay.
So we have a raised hand, but it just says meeting guest. So I'm not quite sure who that is, but maybe that person just, oh, go on.
Hi.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, my name's Carolyn Howell. I'm actually the Strategic Housing Partnership Manager, so Michael knows me quite well. I don't know why my thing always comes up as guest. I seem to be anonymous in these things. Never mind. I'm not sure if this is particularly a question to Michael, but maybe to the wider group as well. It's about the issue that we've been dealing with in relation to your commitments. One of the things we've been looking at is the move on issues for people in supported housing. And obviously looking at your commitments, you know, there's a lot of indication there that registered providers do want to take people with a background in homelessness. But if I'm sort of brutally honest, in a recent workshop that we had with supported housing providers and a recent follow-up conversation I've had with district authorities, it's actually quite difficult to get providers to take on people in that move on process. And sometimes it is about the affordability assessment, unfortunately. And I appreciate that Broadland has been doing a lot of work on this. You know, appreciating that there are not many single unit properties coming up anyway, but the feeling is that it is very difficult to get your people out of support housing into registered provider accommodation. So I just wonder how the commitment can help to address that, maybe.
You're going to have a go at that, David.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, that's something that when we first set up Homes for Cathy and I was going around the country talking about it, there was a lot of people, local authorities particularly, saying associations as part of the problem solution business, and a lot of criticism in the way of housing homeless people. I mean, it is far more complex than that. Obviously, you know, it's partly to do with nomination rights, it's partly to do with availability of accommodation, you know, when you've had the right to buy, and associations are not necessarily letting a lot of properties in any one year. And of course, it's also partly to do with tenancy sustainment. You know, do you check that someone can sustain their tenancy before you offer it to them, or do you, you know, take a fairly Michael's approach, which is, well, if they don't have a tenancy with us, where are they going to possibly live? So it is quite difficult. I think we have achieved a lot in Homes for Cathy in getting, you know, that there was a particular commitment on not putting barriers in the way of housing homeless people, and to consider all of the circumstances of someone rather than having a blanket turning down process, whereby someone who perhaps had built up arrears and been evicted many years before never had a second chance of being housed by the local housing association. So I think evictions and we've been going, but it's still an issue. How can you try to help everybody? And I suppose to a certain extent, what is the priority for homeless people when there are other people who desperately need housing? And, you know, you've regularly got people knocking on your door saying, can you house people with learning disabilities? You know, can you house people fleeing domestic violence, etc., etc. So I think it's an ongoing debate that we need to continue to have in the sector. But
I don't know whether David,
that we are not putting up barriers and we're not part of the problem.
your your internet kept dipping out, but I think everyone heard generally. I do think it's about working in partnership with others. It's with the local authority, but it's also ensuring that there's the right support in place. And at Broadham, we know that we're not very good at support, so we always try to work with other organisations who are. But I think it's a real challenge. It's also a real challenge to get people to find the move on accommodation. Generally, you know, we got a bit of that problem in what the government like to call housing first, but in which they required us to only give 2-year tenancies, which is actually a bit of a rub, because housing first isn't about giving somebody a time limited tenancy and moving them on. But you're right, it's a real challenge, because you're having to work with your local authority partners to ensure that you because they make the nominations. Vicky, is there another hand up? You're on mute.
We have a question. I think this is general posed to you and David. Are you subsidising people who don't pass affordability checks? From Charlotte Phillips.
We don't subsidise, and that's a conscious decision. What we do is we put the tenancy support team in place to try to access the right money for them. We've always had this sort of difficult rub. We're not convinced that it's fair to ask all other tenants to subsidise some tenants, if you see what I mean. So we're much better, rather than doing a fund to subsidise people, to find access to funding. But David may have a different answer.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if I'm still, my internet's still going in and out, is it? Or you can.
I think it's okay.
You can see. Yeah. Sorry, I've just moved room, so I missed the question. What was the question to answer, Michael? Sorry.
Are you subsidising people who don't pass affordability checks?
No, we're not. We're not. We do have some people who fail the affordability checks, and we're kind of working through those. I mean, we're doing a lot. We've got our rent most because we've done a lot of development since affordable rents came in. So affordability is a particular issue, and also the local housing allowance and the universal benefits cap is an issue. So we struggle in some parts of our area, particularly those close to London, where rents are high, and local authority local housing allowance caps don't necessarily allow the full rent to be. I think for anyone who's operating in high rent areas, of working out that dilemma between assessing people for their ability to sustain a tenancy. Yeah, well, what's the alternative if you don't actually house them?
Thanks, David. I think, yeah, we probably we did have one more question. Right. We might squeeze it in, maybe just before we move on to Henry. Paul Seymour says, we have a living well fund that can be used to assist new and existing tenants. Do you have a specific fund for new tenants?
Is this directed at me or Michael?
Well, perhaps Michael wants to chip in.
We don't, but we work.
Yeah, I can
instead.
say that in Hightown we have a tenancy. Sorry, Michael, you go ahead.
I was just going to say we don't have a specific fund. We work with the individual tenant to work out what they need, and then we try to target that through our tenancy support team. And sometimes it's ensuring that they've got the right things to move into a home, because there's a massive difference between moving into a home. I'm always reminded by the tenant who lives in South Norwich, who told me that when he moved into our flat, which was brand new at the time and lovely and sparkly, he had a sleeping bag and a bag of cutlery. and that was his total. And he regards it as a complete miracle that he made that place turn into a home. So we're much more targeted to what does that particular tenant actually need, and where can we access it from, whether it's normally through other organisations.
Thanks, Michael. I think we should probably move on now to our.
I don't know if you heard me, but
yeah.
sorry, is my internet dropping out again, Vicky? Sorry.
Yeah, it is. So I just said I think we probably should move on to our presenters now.
Shall I? Do you want to introduce them?
Yeah, I can do.
If I.
Yeah, it might be better because you're dropping out a bit, David. Yeah, so I'd like to welcome Henry Baptiste from BME National and Pathway Housing Solutions. And really, I wanted to invited Henry because one of the sort of the biggest changes to the commitments, I think, is around understanding and removing the barriers that disadvantage some applicants with a background of homelessness, including people from ethnic minorities, the LGBTQ community and migrants, from accessing housing association properties. And I think, sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. And I think, you know, that's maybe that's maybe a you know, one of the sort of biggest challenges and biggest changes around the commitments. So Henry's going to talk a bit about some of the challenges and barriers maybe that people from BME communities face in accessing social housing. So can I pass over to you and share your slides as well, Henry? Let me just do that. Managing the tech and speaking is always fun. Right, so hopefully everyone should be able to see that. Henry, can I pass to you?
Brilliant. I'm assuming that everybody can hear me.
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, so my name's Henry Baptiste. I'm the co-founder of an organisation based in the East Midlands called Pathway Housing Solutions. I also sit on the board of BME National and lead on homelessness for that organisation, but also sit on the National Housing Federation's strategic group on homelessness. As an organisation, Pathway Housing Solutions was commissioned by the British Academy to undertake some research into ethnicity, housing disadvantage and homelessness. And that's an 18-month study that we've been engaged in partnership with the University of Nottingham. And so that research itself has a focus on the following. It covers a range of themes that explores the drivers of and solutions to housing disadvantage and homelessness, with a focus on the role that ethnicity plays in shaping housing disadvantage and homelessness in the BME community, and raises some important questions about unmet needs and about inequity of access and outcomes for people from minority groups. So if you could move to the next slide, please, Victoria. This slide really just it gives you a QR link code to a poll. I don't think we're going to have time to take this, but once the slides are sent out to people, if you could kindly take that poll. It provides a series of questions that we'd like your response on that would support us both in the research, but also we can share those findings with Homes for Cathy as well. So moving on to slide 3. Many of you will already be aware of this, but I think it's important to give some context to this conversation, really, because there are different types of homelessness. We're all aware of visible homelessness. It tends to be associated with people that are rough sleepers, but there's core homelessness, we've defined it as. And we've also defined clearly statutory homelessness. But one of the areas of focus for us has really been around hidden homelessness. And essentially because that's an area where people from Black and racialized minority groups tend to cluster. And what we mean by that is they don't necessarily show up in official homelessness statistics. They tend to find informal ways of resolving or managing their homelessness situation. And for us as an organization, in terms of the research we're doing, that is a focus of our work. And then we have people that are at risk of homelessness. So I'm probably teaching to the converted already. But I think another element to consider in terms of context is health, the issue of health in terms of Michael Marmot's social determinants of health, and recognize that racism is a key part of that as well. We'll all be familiar with the most recent kind of situation in terms of AWEB and AWEB's law that have come out of that as well, that recognizes that housing is a social determinant of health. So that was the next slide, sorry. And then the next slide. So giving a bit more context, I suppose, to our research is, we also recognize that certain communities, and particularly Black, Afro-Caribbean, Black British, tend not to access mainstream services, so statutory and homelessness services we're talking about predominantly here. And then that's one of the reasons why they're not presented in homelessness figures. But we also took the view that homelessness services are kind of Eurocentric, white-centric in the way they adopt policy and practice. And part of the research that we've done is looked at policy and practice and how that disproportionately affects certain communities. So it begs the question there of that homelessness does have another face, because predominantly homelessness is portrayed as white middle class, white male living on the streets. But it also further begs the question is, are these services struggling to access people from these communities, from Black and other racialized minority communities? Is it hard to reach groups, or is it hard to reach services? Are they simply easy to ignore in terms of engagement and in terms of data connection? I've got a statement down there that says, "Man freezes to death while sleeping in car as cold snap hits UK." And that statement is quite poignant for me, because that was taken from a newspaper article in Nottingham. And the man that actually froze in that car was the son of a friend of mine. And so in the reality, homelessness actually affects lives, not just in terms of health and well-being, but in terms of loss of lives. I think it's important that we recognize why we're doing what we do. It is about not just bricks and mortar and shelter, but it's about support for people so that they can access quality, affordable housing. Moving on to our next slide then, please, Victoria. So for me, I think one of the pillars for why we're doing this research is that before decades of struggle, BME communities have continued to find themselves in a situation where they're facing difficulties in terms of housing inequality. And I think the term institutional discrimination pretty well reflects some of the reasons why that might be. So it's a collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color or ethnic origin. And it can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behavior which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping which disadvantage minority ethnic people. And that has been very much the mantra that we've taken with this research. And I think it's important to recognize that talking about race and racial discrimination is important when we talk about homelessness. We know it's an under-researched area. We know also that data gathering is really poor when it comes to ethnically profiled data. But we also know that those decisions or that practice has an adverse impact in terms of services availability to particular groups. So our research aims and objectives, if you can move on to the next slide, please. Just to break it down then. So our research aims and objectives were to explore and seek to explain the barriers that Black and minority ethnic communities encounter in housing and homelessness service provision. We review existing policy practice and literature and data collection methods. I emphasize the thing about data collection methods. I think Michael said earlier on that KPIs and outputs are important for us, capturing data in terms of accessibility, capturing data in terms of the numbers of evictions and abandonments, capturing data in terms of lettings is important in terms of being able to see where their demand is, where their need is, and where their unmet need is as well. 3, explore the potential benefits of alternative models of housing supply and homelessness service provision. And this goes back to a point of partnership working and recognising neither the local authorities or housing associations or the DWP or the police can do this on their own. It's very much about recognising partnership work models of providing housing and homelessness support, and then to explore good practice and ways in which barriers can be overcome. And 6, making recommendations for policy and practice. Excuse me. At the bottom, in red, we basically said it is only once the barriers and challenges are properly understood that any attempt can be made to tackle them. And I think that's quite a point to make. The research provides a focus to ask, why is race still affecting people's housing options in the 21st century? And for me, that's a kind of Blackpool through rock. If you understand what I mean by that, that's a theme essentially of the research. If you could move on to the next slide then, please, Vicky. For us, very much, the rationale for the research is really about being solution focused and recognizing that we can all raise issues, we can all shine a light on the problems, but it's also about seeking solutions as well. But what we have done with the research is we've focused on 4 under-acknowledged sites of where we've identified structural discrimination. They're the areas in blue. And then we've explored 2 areas of strategic intervention where we're seeking solutions in those areas of work. And our research points to ways in which the policy framework essentially leads to exclusion from support and perpetuates disproportionate levels of homelessness amongst racialized minorities. So the next slide. This image resonates with me, and I think it's about recognizing people's homelessness journey is quite different. We're all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. And this is about not taking a one-size-fits-all or homogenous approach to providing support to people and recognizing that specific communities have particular needs that might not be met by the system, the services that are out there. Moving on to the next slide. So what we do know from our research so far is that 1/3 of Black people with experience of homelessness have faced discrimination from a social or private landlord. Asian households at far greater risk of hidden homelessness like overcrowding or doubling up, and that Black people are over 3 times more likely to experience homelessness. And our next slide, essentially the slide in front of you, percentage of homeless households, ethnicity over time. I guess it's going to be difficult for you to see, but what you could see when we send the slides out is this gives a breakdown of those ethnic groups over time that experience homelessness. If you look at the green at the top, that's described as mixed. You can see the trend there. Purple, which is the next one down, Black, and the 3rd being Asian. So over time, you can see there's been dips and troughs, but ultimately, Black people are facing high levels of homelessness. Moving on to the next slide then. So the link between experience of racial discrimination and exposure to homelessness. And this chart really talks about those people who have experienced homelessness or feel that they experience discrimination that has resulted in homelessness for them. And it's based on the evidence we've said earlier on, which is that 1/3 of Black people with the experience of homelessness report discrimination from a social or private landlord. Moving on to the next slide, please. Social housing and poverty. So you can see from that chart, there's a high percentage of Black people that are most likely to live in social rented homes. And clearly from the chart to the side of that, what it also shows that in terms of poverty rates between ethnic groups, those people experiencing greater levels of poverty are actually living in socially rented accommodation. So actually living in social housing association accommodation. This may have implications for people in terms of rent arrears, evictions, tenancy support. We move on to the next slide then, please. Statutory homelessness in England 2020, and OOA essentially stands for out of area replacements. Excuse me. So out of area replacements, local authorities use out of area replacements really to discharge their duties, their statutory duties, and 92% of local authorities disproportionately place black households out of area. Out of those that responded, 25% did not provide data or ethnically profiled data, and 33% of those local authorities who did provide ethnicity data in their response stated they did not record all this data. We'll just move quickly on to the next slide then, please. Again, you can see that in terms of homelessness, percentage of UK households that are overcrowded by ethnicity, you'll find that South Asian communities, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Black African are the categories that are experiencing overcrowding in terms of homelessness. Sorry for running through this. And moving on to slide 16, I think, Vicky. So in terms of the summary of our key findings, we found essentially that the term BAME or BME is quite a homogenous term, and it obscures more than it reveals. It's a catch-all term, essentially. I think one of the things that we've been arguing for in terms of requesting data and ethnically profiled data, that's actually broken down into ethnic groups, because each community will experience homelessness quite differently. Despite research showing that racialized minorities are overrepresented in their experience of housing disadvantage and homelessness, due to methodological limitations, this is likely to be an underestimation of the true situation. We recognise that BME housing associations and other housing associations play a vital role in supporting the needs of racialised minorities, but are struggling in the current funding landscape, and that forms of hidden homelessness are especially prevalent amongst racialised minorities, leading to significant evidence and policy gaps. Moving on to the next slide. Services are struggling to reach or meet the needs of racialised minority groups, and this raises a question around how services are actually commissioned, but also delivering culturally competent services and anti-racist strategies that engage with particular groups. We found that there's been an extensive focus on rough sleepers, and if we use an example of a city in the East Midlands, the homelessness population only makes up 6% of their total. Sorry, the rough sleeper population only makes up 6% of their total homelessness population. But as we're all aware, there are rough sleeper strategies. There was a Kerslake Commission report. There's an extensive amount of investment and funding through the RSAP and SHAP that have gone into addressing rough sleepers. But what we're saying is there are 94% out of that total homelessness population that aren't receiving some of the focus of those resources. And then we've gone on to say that co-production with community groups and third sector organisations and those with lived experience is vital in attempts to reduce housing disadvantage and experience of homelessness. Next slide, please. So what more can the housing sector do? We started with this heading of gift and will, and some of it is about what is in their gift, what is in the capacity of housing associations and partner organisations to do. And then it raises the question of what is in their will, what is in their determination. And those 2 points are really important to consider as we go through this slide. So in terms of some of our suggestions and proposals there, we've talked about cohesive housing and homelessness services. I think this is something that we've acknowledged in some of our research. We found a housing association that provided supported housing as well as general needs housing, and there wasn't a ladder, a transition point for tenants in the supported housing directly into move-on accommodation and in the general needs provision of that provider. So I think that's an area that could be explored, so a natural progression route for people that live in supported housing of a particular housing association can transition into the general needs accommodation. We said that embedding a race lens in housing and homelessness services is crucial to this. In terms of allocations and tenancy sustainment, it's not simply about engaging those people or existing tenants who engage with the service, but looking out for those tenants that aren't engaging with services. An audit of lettings and evictions from an ethnically profiled perspective. This goes back to a point of data collection, reviewing the kind of council nominations agreements and adopting local freedoms and flexibilities. And within that is about the affordability assessment rules as well. Leadership and representation, and this is across the whole of the sector, about embedding race in National Housing Federation and Chartered Institute of Housing strategies, delivering culturally competent training. I think the reason we've emphasised that point there is the issue of race and racial discrimination. Whilst we might deliver homelessness services, the understanding racial discrimination is equally as important as understanding homelessness. The Housing Federation, Homes for Cathy's aspirations or targets, should they be aspirations or should they be targets and KPIs? We recognise that the Homes for Cathy is going through this process of streamlining its commitments. But we felt that sometimes by grouping protected characters together actually undermines and devalues each of those characteristics singularly. Maybe a mandate that a percentage of housing association surplus should be redistributed, to those most at risk, ring fencing the affordable housing programme, equality impact assessments as part of the public sector equality duty, and in terms of asset management plans, ethical disposal of street properties. And this is a recognition that as part of their asset disposal strategies, housing associations or some housing associations are selling their street properties in urban areas with higher concentrations of people from ethnic minorities, where people maybe on low incomes. Those properties are being sold to the private sector, which means they're lost forever to the social housing sector. And then new housing delivery partnerships and models. Looking at partnerships, third sector, community-led housing offers an alternative option. It offers option in terms of street disposals. It also offers an option in terms of developing on small infill sites or move on accommodation. Maybe a percentage also of new build on large schemes or regeneration sites can be allocated for affordable housing in partnership with third sector housing providers, and exploring Section 106 homes, whether or not they can be facilitated, worked in partnership with the third sector so that they can take over the management of some of those schemes. And then coming to the final slides then, what more can the housing sector do? I think in many ways, there are systems and processes and policies and practices and documents out there. The Better Social Housing Review, the Homes that there are, all these long-term plans for housing. What they lack, I think, is some cohesion between housing and homelessness. That there appears to be gaps. There's clearly a focus on housing, but ultimately homelessness needs to be embedded in these strategy documents as well. And the next slide. These were really just comments that we've had from people we interviewed as part of this process. I'll leave it with you really to read those through yourself. Apologies, I've had to rush it through. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Henry. That's brilliant. And we will be sending out all these slides. There's some great sort of facts and figures, and there's some great suggestions as to what we as housing associations can be thinking about. David, I don't know, did you want to take back over the chairing? I'll introduce our final speaker, who is Bridget Young from NACOM, who is going to talk a bit about how we could be thinking as a sector around housing migrants, and particularly those with no recourse to public funds. So I will stop sharing this slide and bring up Bridget's slide.
Thanks very much, Vicky, and well done
That's
for
okay.
multitasking.
Yeah, and thank you, Henry. I've lost track of what I'm saying. But thank you, Henry. That was brilliant. And welcome, Bridget. So let me just bring up this. Okay. Right. Okay, and oh, sorry, just before you start, I was aware that we would. I was hoping we might have time for questions, but I'm conscious that we want to wrap up around 11:30. And so if there's time for questions at the end, then we'll try and fit them in. But we'll let Bridget start.
Great, thank you very much, and I'll take that as a nod to me to try and speed up a little bit. Just to say that I think the internet gremlins are out today, so I'm also experiencing some issues, but I've got a backup, so let me know. Do shout if I'm starting to get patchy. But hi everyone, my name is Bridget Young. I'm the director at NACOM, or the No Accommodation Network. If you can go next slide, please. And for those who don't know us, we are a membership organisation of around 140 charities and community groups across the UK, supporting people facing homelessness and destitution in the asylum and immigration system. Around half of our members deliver accommodation, including in partnership with housing associations. And as an organisation, we support the network through our network development work, which is our core function. And that's really about sharing good practice with members, creating opportunities for partnership working and solidarity. And we also deliver policy research and advocacy, including our lived experience community research program. Next slide, please. So before I go on to some of the solutions, and I'm definitely going to end with solutions, I wanted to actually build on Henry's great presentation to talk a bit about some context, some reasons why people in the asylum and immigration system face homelessness and destitution, and what some of the picture is at the moment before we go into the solutions, to really sharpen the mind and fire you up a little bit. And just to say, non-UK nationals are impacted by the same socioeconomic conditions that drive homelessness across the general population. Low-wage labour, lack of affordable housing, personal needs, and similarly, anyone experiencing homelessness faces the challenges of navigating those multiple complex systems around housing, welfare, health, and social care. Next slide, please. For people subject to immigration control, these challenges can be compounded by conditions created by the immigration system. So the no recourse to public funds, or NRPF condition, I've put there reality and perception, because in reality it does lock people out of support services and out of financial support. But there's also a perception amongst statutory and voluntary services that it means there's absolutely no options for people. And that's not true. We've actually started often using the term restricted eligibility to public funds to sort of break some of that myth. There are also restrictions due to someone's immigration status. So someone seeking asylum is not allowed to work. Give a nod to the long-standing Lift the Ban campaign, which was also reiterated by a recent joint report by the APPGs on migration and on poverty about giving people the right to work. And then I've put there in bold and stars the hostile environment. It can feel like a bit of a throwaway term, but it's really baked into a system which feels like it's more set up to say no to people or make things tough, rather than having a fair, just, and humane asylum and immigration system that places enough importance on efficiency, justice, well-being, and community. I think the recent crisis in homelessness caused by Home Office evictions is an example of this. And also the disgusting videos of Home Office staff detaining people being threatened with deportation to Rwanda is another example of it. And people who, I must just add, the Home Office's own data show would most likely be granted refugee status if they were able to access the asylum system. Today I have a bright pink top and a smile on my face, but a belly full of rage when I say those words. Next slide, please. Just realized that belly full of rage, next slide, please, would be a great ringtone for me. I want to just highlight as well some of the, why do people face homelessness and destitution within the asylum system? People may, there are a number of reasons, including if they are refused asylum and then evicted from home office accommodation with no support or options. So some of these reasons are around poor home office decision making, poor or limited access to legal representation, difficulties with evidence. A culture of disbelief is something we've heard from research from our community research program, limited support, the length of time decisions are taken to be made. The Home Office hasn't actually updated its appeals data, as far as we know, since May 2023, but the proportion of asylum appeals in the year to March 2023 was 51%. And the appeals success rate has been steadily increasing over the last decade, up from 29% in 2010. So there's a lot of injustice and inefficiency in the current system that puts people at real risk. And now, in essence, a dismantling of the asylum system through the Illegal Migration Act and Rwanda Plan, which, we've done a joint briefing with Praxis, which really shows, and Refugee Council have done a lot of work on this, that really shows the risk to homelessness through these policies. Next slide, please. And then just a bit of stats to be thrown your way. So every year we survey our members to get a picture of the scale and scope of homelessness and destitution that they're dealing with across the network. We're about to launch our survey to members for 2023-24, but just some sort of headline stats for you from the previous year's survey, which around 60% of our members responded to. And we know that it's just the tip of the iceberg. But you'll see there that, over 3,700 people were accommodated across the network, nearly 480,000 nights of accommodation, 790 people who had been refused asylum. So linking back to some of the things I covered in the previous slide, and 977 people had refugee status. And just to say, these stats were from before the sort of spike in refugee homelessness that we saw in summer last year. Next slide, please. You'll see there as well that 3,800 people were given financial support and 1,300 people were rough sleeping or in informal or insecure accommodation when they approached members. We've been seeing over the years that evictions from home office accommodation remains persistently high. And again, I say before the crisis, but also that, we're trying to track unmet need a bit better in the network. And last year, over 2,200 people could not be accommodated and needed accommodation by our members. Next slide, please. Then just a final bit of context setting was just to highlight another piece of Joseph Rowntree Foundation research, their destitution in the UK report from last year. It's part of a series that they do, and we were on the advisory group for last year's report. And what this shows is that approximately 3.8 million people were experiencing homelessness and experienced destitution in 2022 when the fieldwork happened, including around 1 million children. That's an increase of 61% since the last survey in 2019, and almost 2.5 times since the one before that in 2017. And the number of children experiencing destitution since 2017 has almost tripled. The report breaks down experiences of destitution into a further 3 groups. So you've got UK other, migrants with no complex needs, and complex needs. And that's because there are particular drivers for these 3 groups. Next slide, please. And just to finish the highlights from that piece of research, it shows that UK nationals accounted for almost 3/4 of the population identified as living in destitution, but people who have migrated to the UK were overrepresented, and also that the rate of destitution amongst Black-led households were 3 times their population share. What really struck me overall on the report from a NACOM perspective is that firstly, it's horrendous and unacceptable that it's happening in the UK. The numbers and human stories in the report are really powerful and damning. And clearly, destitution and the growth of destitution is a systemic issue facing huge parts of the country. It's not something people can just pick themselves up by their bootstraps and sort and drag themselves out of. I found it helpful that it situated migrant destitution within this context, as migrants are so often blamed or othered, but also the report really identifies the disproportionate rate of destitution amongst Black respondents and migrant respondents, which I think again shows the devastating and material effects of structural racism and the hostile environment on communities and individual lives. Next slide, please. So now that I've done my slides of doom, as a colleague named them, I hope I haven't overwhelmed you, but rather, as I said earlier, sharpened the mind to now turn to the question of why should housing associations step up? I mean, because of everything I told you, we should just go home now. But it's the right thing to do. There are things you can do. It's a way to meaningfully meet your organization's EDI and anti-racist practice commitments and helps create diverse and thriving communities. Next slide, please. And what are the ways that you can do this? You can work in partnership to deliver accommodation. And this can be partnerships between statutory bodies, housing providers, voluntary sector, community groups, migrants with lived experience of homelessness and destitution. There are a number of different models where housing providers work in partnership with NACOM members to provide that end to migrant homelessness. And some of these models include cross-subsidy, free or peppercorn rent for void or gifted properties, use of meanwhile properties, local authority commissioned accommodation, and accessibility of nomination rights. Next slide, please. Obviously, we love the idea of accommodation solutions, but there are other things that housing associations and housing providers can do, including providing access to your existing services and support. So sharing your housing management expertise, providing access to services that you might have to your residents, and access to any employment support, not relevant for everyone, but really vital for some people. Next slide, please. And then could you support local organisations working with people seeking asylum, refugees and migrants within RPF by providing office or meeting space, admin or governance support, access to skills, resources and networks that you might have internally, or funding, fundraising, amplifying their work? As with all of this, it often is about that relationship building, as with so much in life. And as I said earlier, we'd obviously like to see accommodation solutions, but it can really start from anywhere. And often, it doesn't start with a grand big housing or accommodation project, but it starts with something smaller that builds that trust and relationship between different partners. Next slide, please. I was asked to cover about, this question about illegality and legality, because I think, a lot of people are worried about that. And what I would say to that is, don't be swayed or scared to think that you can't help anyone. Don't buy into the illegal migrant narrative, because the immigration system is layered and complex and people are entitled to different things. You're in the business of providing homes and supporting people with housing, both permanent and temporary, including for some of the people in our communities most at risk of harm and most in need of a home. You already work within and wade through a myriad of rules and regulations, laws and legislation, guidance and good practice, whether that's on planning, building, estate maintenance, housing allocations, working with vulnerable families or financial management. And this is the same. It's just about understanding what you can and can't do and working with specialist partners like NACOM members who can help you understand that. So really sort of simplify it. Don't get scared by it and just work with specialist partners. Next slide, please. I've got here a few case studies, just to really show you that I'm not just pretending and saying, I promise it's possible. There are solutions. There are actually amazing housing associations and NACOM members who are doing great accommodation work together, looking at different models from cross-subsidy through to voids due to bedroom tax, through to providing housing rent-free, which is coupled with in-house legal support. So I've just touched on a couple of examples there. Next slide, please. But actually, what I will tell you to do is much better, is to look at our Working with Housing Associations toolkit, which we actually launched at the Homes for Cathy conference in October last year. In that, you'll see plenty more about different housing and partnership models, far more detail about the case studies that are highlighted and more case studies, information about how to make the case for working together, more details on the kind of legal situation. And I think my colleague Tom is going to pop the link to the toolkit in the chat, and also to say that you can hear more about this in detail at a joint event that we're hosting with RHAG on the 14th of May in London. So I think Tom's going to put the link in the chat because I can't multitask like Vicky can. Next slide, please. So just sort of some thoughts from me is that I'm really glad to see Homes for Cathy's continued commitment to being part of ending migrant homelessness. The system is hostile and complex. I think it's always important that whatever we do, we treat everyone with humanity, with respect, and with dignity. I take Henry's comment about, the question mark over if you don't have a specific focus on groups with protected characteristics, you risk diluting their services, and I think that is a real risk. I'm really glad to see the sort of the pledge being expanded to talking about removing barriers for a number of marginalized groups, because I think, on the flip side, we don't want people to be othered. No one should face homelessness. Everyone deserves housing. And it just leave you with the thought that there are and will continue to be solutions to homelessness and destitution for people in the asylum and immigration system. And I challenge you to be part of that solution. The last slide has just got some contact details on, but these will be shared with you separately as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bridget. I've moved to a different place in our office, so hopefully you can hear me. Okay, if I start to freeze again, Vicky had better take over. Thanks, Bridget, and thank you, Henry. That was really, well, I suppose challenging, really, for housing associations. So have people got any questions, comments, thoughts? Susanna, you've raised your hand. Do you want to come in?
I did. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks for all of the presentations so far. I did have a question specifically for Bridget, and thanks, Bridget, for your passionate and inspiring presentation. The NHF are having a think about what we can do, or what more we can do in this area. My colleague Dylan, who I don't think can be here today, is leading that. I had a bit of a geeky question about the kind of tenancy arrangements or tenure arrangements when housing associations do offer accommodation to people with no recourse. What kind of tenure does that tend to be? Is it ASTs, the short tenancies, or licenses, or something else? And we know that the Renters Reform Bill is coming as well, and that will mean that there won't be a short hold tenancies anymore. Does that have any impact?
So when you don't have an AST when there's no rent being paid, I suppose, and often, and whenever there's accommodation being provided for people with no recourse, no rent is being paid by the individual. It may be that the organisation takes on financial responsibility and leases that property, and they will be cross-subsidising. They would lease a house. So you've got situations where they would lease a house and have cross-subsidised from another house where there are people paying rent, and so they take on the financial responsibility. So in terms of agreements, it would be it's sort of a different type of agreement. It's not really a housing agreement because there's not kind of rent being paid. I think we would definitely, my background is in housing. I did a lot of work with the Renters Reform Coalition in a previous life, so I'm really interested in the Renters Reform Bill, but I think we will have to really look at what the implications are. And this, this goes back to the implications of, Awab's law, of lots of different, really good things that are being brought in. And we always want to have a look and see what the implications will be for NACOM members, who are often smaller local charities, sort of filling gaps and making things work. So I think there will be implications. I don't know what they will be yet, but in terms of, it won't directly affect the provision to people with NRPF, but it may affect the sort of wider provision around kind of cross subsidies and that sort of thing.
Good. Thanks, Bridget. Any other questions or comments? Or we've got a lot to contemplate there from Henry and Bridget. I hate to say that the capacity of housing associations to respond is not generally increasing at the moment, but we are all trying to do our best, I think, a lot of us anyway. Any other thoughts, comments? No. Well, perhaps it's almost 11:30, so perhaps a few closing remarks, just to thank Vicky very much for doing all the organisation and hard work to get this this event going, and of course to keep Cathy going, because she's the main resource that we've got. And thank you very much to the speakers for giving their time. We hope that you'll all engage with our new commitments and engage with the challenges that our speakers have put up. Final words from me really is to just sort of highlight what Homes for Cathy is doing at the moment, which is we're trying to engage with the political parties to get homelessness as part of their manifestos, and working with other organisations, including, of course, the NHF, the CIH crisis, and everyone else. We're kind of trying to put together some kind of hustings event in Westminster in the summer, and we'll have to give you more news of that later on. But in particular, and again, I had to ask NHF and CIH members to close, staff to close their ears at the moment, but at this point, because we are going to hear at the Housing 2024 conference in June in Manchester, and we've got a stall there, and Vicky's running a fringe event, and I'm speaking at one of the main events there. So if you're at Manchester in June, please come along and say hello to us. We're also got a breakfast meeting at the National Housing Federation CIH conference in September, so hopefully you can come along to that as well. Any thoughts, comments on today will be very welcome, and thank you very much for all attending. And particularly thank you to the speakers, who I would applaud if get you all to applaud if you all came off mute, but probably that's too ambitious for today. So thanks very much to everyone, and see you soon. Thanks for your support for Homes for Cathy.